Hello, Vincent Carroll speaking. This tutorial number 12, is on cancer. Cancer is a very broad topic, so I should hope I will do a number of different tutorials on different aspects of cancer, but some very broad ideas first of all, and these are mainly based on my own observations. I suppose the majority of cancers still tend to trace back to liver qi stagnation. If qi becomes stagnant, qi eventually becomes solid, and a solid tumour is a solid lump or a bump. Not all of them are malignant from a Western medical point of view. In fact, from a TCM medical point of view, there's very little difference between those that are malignant and those that are not. So, for example, take a solid tumour like a fibroid, for example, that would not be classified as a tumour from a Western medical point of view. Or take a solid tumour of the descending colon. Both of these tumours are tumours as a result of qi stagnation if they happen to be solid. But what if the tumour is sloppy and has very poor margins on it and spills out, if you like? The typical tumour maybe with tentacles. Say, for example, a tumour like a brain tumour, or a tumour that might be a pancreatic or a tumour of the gallbladders, in particular what's called a cholangiocarcinoma. These tumours are quite dangerous. They're difficult to operate on simply because they have tentacles, simply because they don't have defined margins. You can't just cut above, cut below and sew it together as you can perhaps for a small tumour of the descending colon. They present different challenges, and I find these tumours are often phlegm tumours, and phlegm tumours phlegm comes from damp, and damp comes from the spleen not transforming fluid. So at some point or other, there has been a catastrophic failure of the spleen to transform fluid. It morphed into phlegm, and phlegm became hot, and phlegm became more solid, but much, much less solid than a main qi stagnation tumour. So in other words, I divide tumours from a TCM perspective, at least the ones I deal with in my practice, into two broad categories. Those that are very solid and are associated with a qi stagnation that probably traces back to liver and might be as a result of a lifetime of qi stagnation. The square peg in the round hole, for example, maybe the person in the wrong occupation or the wrong relationship or whatever it might be. But that year on year on year, it grinds the person down, the qi becomes stagnant, and eventually that may well manifest as a tumour. But then there are the other tumours, the tumours associated with phlegm. And in those cases, in the majority of people who've come to me, particularly young people, I find that it's often as a result of a collapse of the spleen's capacity to transform fluid secondary to shock. I often consider shock to be a bit like the earthquake, where the buildings and old structure above wobble, but it's unpredictable which will fall and which will not. So therefore, when you have a phlegm tumour, sometimes, occasionally, the area that suffers most is the spleen's ability to transform fluid. And if the spleen fails to transform fluid, there's damp, and damp can morph into phlegm. So in a tiny minority of tumours, my belief is that they are phlegm tumours secondary to a collapse of kidney energy, usually secondary to shock. Of course, ordinary phlegm as well can morph into become a tumour. I think that's probably relatively unusual. But the underlying, I suppose, characteristic of all the tumours tends to be heat. And I often find that the more aggressive is the tumour, the hotter or fierier the tumour is. And therefore, the greater the benefit in taking heat out, both taking heat out systemically and taking heat out locally. Now, obviously, taking heat out systemically, you're dealing with deep toxic heat. So you're talking about spleen 10 bilateral, but also any other bits of heat as well, like Sanja number 6, obviously, large intestine 4, large intestine 11, maybe prick the top of the ears to make it bleed 3 drops of blood out or whatever. All of this can be helpful in reducing heat, but the majority point is of course spleen 10, because it's deep at deep blood level, and to cool the blood is one of the things you must do. But I often find it very, very helpful as well to take heat out locally. And I often find it a very remarkable thing to do. Certainly if a person has an abdominal carcinoma, say over the left descending colon, then in that case to just put a scatter of points into the adipose tissue over the area, not necessarily acupuncture points, though they may well be on the stomach channel, like stomach 20, I suppose 6, 7, 8, 9, that sort of stuff on the left side. But equally you may scatter them absolutely anywhere. I like to scatter them as well under the right rib cage where the liver is, because very often there's secondary carcinoma in the liver. And if you do drop the needle in over where the tumour is, the amount of heat demonstrated by blushing of heat around the needle is often remarkable. And I would do that many times, as frequently as possible, because heat's generated all the time. So as heat is generated all the time, if you can remove that heat, that brings a great benefit to the patient. I believe it slows the replication of the cells down, because these cells require heat. They are accelerated, and heat itself is an accelerant, so you need to take the heat out to deaccelerate the tumour, because the characteristic of tumour cells is that they are in overdrive. They're overspeeding. They're in a way normal cells that are overspeeding, and if you can take the speed out, you bring them nearer to mimic ordinary cells progressing at a normal rate. So taking heat out, in my mind, is essential in any system of medicine. But obviously if there's phlegm, then in that case you have to approach it from a phlegm point of view, and that goes right back to supporting the kidney. If it's the more standard, I suppose, liver qi stagnation type lump or bump or tumour or whatever, then in that case you just got to keep moving qi and giving the person some element of insight into it. I always remember an elderly gentleman who came to see me. He had retired from the Department of Education, and he was somebody who was in charge of the exams, and for years he was terrified that there would be a breach of security on the exam papers, as indeed there was on a couple of occasions, so he had good reason to be worried. But he had a tumour of the descending colon, but he spent his life worried that he wasn't doing his professional duty to the best of his ability. So he had a tumour. Sadly the man died. I did the best I could for him. I took out heat, I moved things around, but he was quite fatalistic, because the doctors had told him that, you know, it's a terminal illness, so therefore in his mindset it was a terminal illness. So I considered that what I did for him was a failure. A few months later I got a letter in the post from his wife, an absolutely lovely letter, in which she stated that she thanked me for explaining to him where the tumour came from, the fact that he had so much qi stagnation as a result of concern and worry, and a devotion to duty, I mean, let's call it as it is, which is admirable, but it cost him his life, because it created this element of qi stagnation. So a little warning in that. So this is a very brief run through aspects of carcinoma, aspects of cancer, and I hope to do some other videos in the near future expanding upon this, which is a vast topic, the whole topic of cancer. Thank you.